Hi, welcome to Blogging Heads TV. This is Culturally Determined, and I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade. And my guest today is Alan Kurzweil. Alan, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, Ari. This is Alan Kurzweil. I'm talking from Providence, Rhode Island.
And you are the author of a new book that I'm holding up to the camera right now. It's called Whipping Boy, The 40-Year Search for My 12-Year-Old Bully. This is a really enjoyable book. It first came to my attention through an excerpt that ran in the New Yorker a couple months ago, which tells the basics of the story, but the book really goes a lot deeper and is, if you enjoyed the New Yorker article, as I think probably everyone would,
Except
I
perhaps
would.
Cesar.
Right. Well, we'll get to that. I would recommend checking the book out as well. So why don't we start by talking about kind of the setting of the first part of the book, which is a very unusual prep school you went to called Eglon. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. Uh, in 1971, I was a scrawny Jewish kid living in New York, and my father had died 5 years before, and my mother was struggling to reinvent herself professionally and decided to go back to school to become an academic. And that meant conducting some research in Italy for a year. And during that year abroad, she warehoused me in this really curious boarding school in Switzerland, about an hour and a half away from where she was doing her work. The school, Eglon College, was a holding pen of privileged kids for the most part. There were some middle class kids like myself. Very few of them were Jewish. I was one of five. And I found myself placed in the top of a dormitory tower called Belvedere with four other boys, and the ringleader of the group was a Filipino kid, 2 years my senior, named Cesar Augustus. The book, Whipping Boy, is a chronicle of the year I spent under the thumb of Cesar Augustus and the subsequent repercussions of that uh, year of trauma and bullying.
Uh, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the specific things that Caesar did to you, including the thing that gives the book its title?
Sure. Well, as you mentioned in the setup, Eglon was a curious place. It was an English boarding school in Switzerland. It was part Boy Scout camp, part Buddhist retreat. There was very little surveillance on the part of the administrators, uh, but there were any number of rules. In fact, there was a 34-page rule book every kid was required to remember. But once we were in that room, once we were in the dormitory room up at the top of the tower, there was no supervision of any kind except by the senior boys. And in this particular context, the most senior boy was Caesar. And he very quickly started making my life quite hellacious. The taunts initially were verbal. He would call me all sorts of mildly anti Semitic names, nosy, for example. Um, uh, but the taunts quickly escalated to the physical. Um, he at one point saturated little bits of bread with hot sauce and forced me to eat them. Probably the most dramatic incident, and as you mentioned, the one that gives the book its title, came about a month and a half into my stay at Eglon, and I was only there for a year. Uh, Caesar and his sidekick, bullies always seem to have a sidekick. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
where would Malfoy be without his Crab and Goyle? But in any case, my Malfoy tied me up to a bedpost and reenacted one of the more horrific songs in the hit Broadway musical Jesus Christ Superstar. And this song in particular, which is called, fittingly enough, the 39 Lashes, required him to draw up and lower a belt on my back 39 times. Um, I should point out that he didn't do this to hurt me physically. It was more an act of humiliation, and
Mm-hmm.
one that caused me as a 10-year-old and uh, the youngest boy in the entire school to feel quite deeply.
Mm-hmm. Um, now, as you've been, as you wrote the book, and as you've been promoting it, I'm sure you've had to retell these particular examples multiple times. I mean, how does that affect you? Remembering having
It depends.
to describe these traumatic events.
It depends which anecdote I'm talking about. I mean, for many years, I tried to internalize these pains by rendering them into stories of comic hijinks. And so I was able to resurrect my memories with a sort of lighthearted take for the longest time. And then at a certain point, for reasons we can discuss, that was no longer possible. But
Hmm.
there's one incident, there's no question that there's one incident where every time I do tell it, uh, I do find myself transported both to a time and place when I was uh, filled with joy and then also with deep sorrow. I think that the thing that caused me the most anguish during my time with Cesar in Switzerland revolved around my a cherished keepsake, an object I took with me to Switzerland over the protests of my mother, and that was my father's Omega wristwatch. As I mentioned, my father died when I was 5, and when I found myself going off to boarding school at 10, I pestered my mother to allow me to carry Dad's watch with me. And I wore that watch everywhere and always, except when I had to take showers, which at this school was quite often because we were required to do cold showers in the early morning and then uh, tepid ones in the late afternoon after skiing. In any case,
And your description of the showers is particularly vivid, to say the least.
right. Well, because of a hydraulic failing, the the detritus and scum of the kids would all collect in the drain, and it was always the youngest and weakest boys who were required to take their showers at the drain end of this long row of shower stalls. And so one of my jobs, apart from showering, was to declog the effluvia, this of adolescent uh, grime and grease. And the consequence of that also morphed into a pretty nasty case of verrucas, which was a word I didn't know until I went to Eglon. And for those of your viewers who aren't familiar with that term, it's the British equivalent of ingrown warts.
Hmm.
Anyway, I returned from that from the shower and lifted the pillow of my bunk and discovered that the watch I had placed there just moments before was gone. And I think it was the loss of my father's wristwatch that really compelled or propelled me forward on this 40-year search. I think it was a totem of sorts. It was my rosebud. It was the object that connected me to a time and place when I was loved and felt truly comforted by both my mother and my father. And so when that watch was stolen, and I soon after learned that it had been launched out the window of my dorm room into the snow and never recovered, when that watch sailed out the window, my connection to my father didn't exactly sail out, but it was put in jeopardy.
Hmm. Um, in the book, I think there's. I wanted to ask you. We don't want to spoil too much, but you eventually do find your bully as an adult and find his tell his a very unusual life story. Um, it seemed to me possible that one of the henchmen actually just swiped the watch for himself and didn't actually throw it out the window. Do you think that's possible?
Well, I did keep this really absurd hope beyond hope that I would confront my childhood nemesis 40 years later, and there, strapped on his wrist, would be my father's watch. And in the course of my investigation, which was extensive and international and included a survey of countless scrapbooks gathered up by classmates and other schoolmates who were attending Eglon while we were there, I did survey carefully the wrists of Cesar and his friends in the hope that I would be able to find the watch that allegedly, and I'm quite sure did in fact, get launched for no other reason than to cause me anguish.
Mm-hmm. So Caesar. Sorry, keep on. So go ahead.
Yeah, this on a absurd technical note. I suppose if my obsession really had no bounds, I could take a Geiger counter to the back field of the school, because my father's watch was one of the last that was painted with radioactive paint. And so as it's, in fact, decaying in the hillside, it's emitting a radioactivity that I suppose a Geiger counter could pick up. My commitment to the story did not extend to that.
Wow, that's that's definitely a resonant image of the power of memory. Releasing even literally buried. Something is still being released. So then you were able. So Cesar mysteriously left midterm, and you had at least a okay time for the rest of the term, and then you left the school, so you were only there for 1 year. And one of the, let's talk a little bit about bullying in general and how the cultural conversation about bullying has really changed over the past 5 to 10 years. One of the things your book made me think was that the classic bully situations in literature are often at prep schools because, as you said, the kids kind of rule the roost and have their own system of punishment, and there's no escape from your bully. And in your case, you were in the same bedroom as your bully, which seems particularly bad. Today with what cyberbullying is a big problem, and I thought that the prep school atmosphere has kind of been recreated through the internet, because for kids who are connected all the time, they're always online. It used to be if you went to regular school and you had a bully, your home was a refuge. But with cyberbullying, you could, if everyone has their phone on all the time and someone is taunting someone else, the always on aspect means that there's no longer an escape.
Yeah, there's no question that the web provides not provides, but subjects students, people generally, to a relentless stream of both information and, for the unfortunate, menace. And there's no question that the incessant and ever-present force of Facebook and all of those other social media platforms really offers the mean-spirited any number of new techniques to cause their targets humiliation. I would suggest that, and I say this with a measure of surprise, that that cyberbullying, though with the novelty of the prefix, is really only a variation of this ever-present sense of trauma that older people whose childhoods predated the internet had to endure as well. Now, they had some. I don't want to say that it's no worse now than it was then. There is no question that, as you pointed out, we could go home. It might have been a year after the trauma, or if you attended day school, you could get home by 3 or 3:30 and find a refuge. But I would argue that those pains and the sense of injustice that those of us who are older felt linger long after we leave school.
Hmm.
And I say this because of the outpouring of responses that the New Yorker piece and that the book have generated, not exclusively from younger readers who identify with the sense of, of bullying that I endured, but also among a very large and vocal contingent of older readers whose memories of their own pains as children were resurrected by the story. And so, what I would argue is the scars of early childhood remain. I mean, they are scars, they
Hmm.
stay with us. And they may not be constantly picked at or uh, um, presented the way absent the web, but there are still very much, these are very much issues that need to be addressed.
Hmm.
Uh, so I think the cyberbullying is an absolutely horrific phenomenon. But I also, and this as I said came as a tremendous surprise, was struck by how many people whose childhoods predated the internet nonetheless retain those memories of childhood torment and injustice.
Hmm.
And so that was one of the bigger surprises that emerged from the publication of this particular story.
Hmm. Now, when I first read the New Yorker piece, it suddenly recalled to my mind a piece of advice that my father gave to me when I was a boy and I was being bullied. And his advice was just punch him in the nose. And I did not do that because I was one of the smallest kids in my class, and this was a bigger kid. And so I don't remember exactly. I don't think I told my parents about it, and they perhaps talked to the teachers. But I don't think I ever really fought back um, directly. Certainly not physically. Maybe I would try to taunt back or something like that. And so as a kid, I didn't do this, and I was too scared to do it. But thinking back on it, I wonder if that was good advice because I think the bully usually doesn't just isn't picking someone to pick on, isn't choosing someone to pick on based on some intense personal hatred. It's usually just looking for someone who's a little different or a little weaker. And so if I had punched the bully in the face, he probably would have just moved on to bully someone else. What do you think of that?
Well, my mind goes in two different directions. First of all, it compels me to confront a very obvious fact, and that was I was fatherless when I was forced to deal or not deal, avoid or contend with Caesar. And so I hear your story with a sense of almost with a sense of jealousy for having had the father who could proffer advice.
Mm-hmm.
And that was brought into high relief when I found myself in the role of father, dealing with my 5-year-old son, who, like you and like me, had to deal with a playground bully. The advice I gave him was inept. I didn't have the confidence to say punch him in the nose. I didn't have the confidence to say anything because I found myself in uncharted territory.
Mm-hmm.
I was compelled to deal with his pain, which happened to be a pain that I had never been able to contend with. And so the two of us actually responded to his bullying and, by implication, to my own, the only way I knew at the time to deal with that, and that was through writing. So my advice, it wasn't direct advice, but by example, we dealt with in his particular case a boy named or nicknamed Hank the Tank because of his dimensional liabilities.
Mm-hmm.
So we wrote a story together in which we were able to serve up a little bit of whoop ass, albeit fictional,
Mm-hmm.
to an amalgam of Hank the Tank and Caesar Augustus. And so I guess it was the response that we had, which seemed to work quite well, was when he raises a fist, you raise a pen. Now
Mm-hmm.
that's a rather sophisticated response, but it's one that worked. And I would like to think that, I don't know if that advice in your particular case, to punch him in the nose, would have been viable. Like you, I was a scrawny kid, and Cesar had 30 pounds on me. And there was no way I could take him on, particularly since, I slept 10 feet away from my tormentor
Hmm.
day after day. So there was no reprieve. Um, but that said, I think I'm hypothesizing. Excuse me, I'm hypothesizing now. Uh, I think a punch in the nose would have suspended the unwanted attentions he directed at me, and I say this on the basis uh, of the life he led after he finished school.
Right. So why don't we move to that? So that's really the second part of your story, where you go in search of Caesar and try to figure out what became of him, and you discover you know an incredible story that if it was fiction, people would say this could never happen. This is unrealistic.
Yeah, my wife for months and months campaigned for me to render the discoveries I made into a work of fiction, into a novel. I am most of the time a novelist, but that would have been impossible because I stumbled on a tale that was so improbable that to fictionalize anything at all, to change Caesar's name, to change the names of his collaborators, to elide any of the criminal discoveries I stumbled upon, would have either rendered the story toothless or unbelievable, or both.
Right. So why don't we talk about the Badish uh, fraud that
Sure,
Caesar was attached to? So can you explain, um, what happened and how Caesar was connected to it?
sure. So after writing this children's book, the story of a bully that I mentioned earlier, in collaboration with my son, I went around to one school and then another still. And at every school I went, kids, fourth and fifth graders, sixth graders, would raise their hands and ask, pester really, is the bully based on a real person? And I would acknowledge that indeed he was. And then the kids would push further and say, what happened to your bully? And I was unable to answer that question. I had intermittently over the years, I'd even taken a train up to Switzerland while I was on a book tour in Italy to see if I could find out what happened to Caesar. I found out nothing at all except for
Hmm.
a mailing address. In any case, by the time the kids were pestering me, um, that would have been the early 2000s or 2003. And the internet was coming into its own. And so I did what so many of us do about so many things that linger from our past, whether it's bullies or ex-girlfriends or whatever else. I put Caesar's rather unusual name into the search window of Google. And the first hit I got uh, indicated that he had become a distinguished professor of chemical engineering and a philanthropist who presided over a charitable organization called St. Vincent de Paul. It took me a few more clicks to realize that, and I will be the first to admit this, much to my relief, that Caesar was not the Caesar I was looking for. And I had a number of false positives before I found an extremely promising lead, and that was in 2005, courtesy of the New York Post, which described this outrageous and improbable scam called the Badisha Bank and Trust. The story is as follows. A group of pretend noblemen, none of whom had more than a high school degree, rented out suites at the Waldorf Astoria, claimed to oversee a multi-billion-dollar Swiss bank, and then fleeced no fewer than 10 seemingly savvy entrepreneurs out of millions of dollars. And the principal roper in this operation, the shill, the one who U.S. prosecutors subsequently said brought the lambs to the slaughter, was a fellow named Cesar Augustus. Now, obviously, I was intrigued by this discovery. It took me another year to establish positively that the bully in the boarding school had become the shill from San Francisco. And I did that because I was able to connect to a number of lawyers and prosecutors who provided all manner of documentary evidence confirming that Cesar, in fact, had grown up to be an international swindler.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, so it's a great story, your quest and uncovering what actually happened and this incredible scam that they were running, and kind of in brief, they would, pretend to be this very old line bank who would.
The props were outrageous. These guys wore monocles. They carried walking sticks. They had a 14-point dress code that required that they never present business cards. The head of the bank identified himself as Prince Robert von Badisch von Bronkov and Katsukatani Kimchivili, 74th Grand Master of the Knights of Malta Ecumenical.
Uh-huh.
His associate, the administrator of the Badisch Trust, who identified himself variously as Colonel or Major Sherry, a moniker that compelled one of the three prosecutors to characterize the fraud as one of Dirty Rotten Scoundrels meets Clue, claimed to have a degree from Wharton and a distinguished military career, when in fact evidence subsequently submitted at trial confirmed that he was a high school dropout with a GED, and that the highest rank he had ever achieved in any institution was that of assistant store manager at a Radio Shack in Queens, New York.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the logistics of the scam were they would demand a kind of like 0.5% of the total loan as some kind of temporary guarantee. It's from the mark.
Right. The language they used was very complicated and ornate, as was everything associated with this fraud. But the bottom line was it was a real life version of those ridiculous Nigerian letters that we all get in our spam folders. Mm-hmm. The only difference was they conducted their meetings and proposed their arrangements in hotel suites, and actually soon after they started this, they managed to hornswoggle and dupe lawyers at Clifford Chance, which at the time was the largest law firm in the world, to provide them access to their boardroom. And so the window dressing was so top-notch that all of these would-be borrowers were completely hoodwinked by these pretend noblemen.
Right. And so the people who were scammed were often people who had an investment idea that was rejected by other banks. And then Cesar or another shill would find them and kind of entrap them in this web. One of the interesting things I thought about how they ran the scam was that there was this kind of sub-thread of bullying and how the scammers treated their victims, because they demanded that they, fly over the world to meetings. They, if there was some small slight, they demanded a letter of apology, making them grovel before them. And this seemed to be, I guess, a psychological trick of seeming like, oh, we don't really want your business. This is all a favor to you. But it kind of also is the bully victim dynamic playing out.
Absolutely. Time and again, even after they had managed to swindle these business people, they would take great delight in further humiliating them and causing them even more emotional suffering that yielded very little financial dividend for the scammers. Uh, I had to talk, and I did this any number of times with the victims who felt horrible, not simply and not exclusively or not even principally about having lost $400,000-$500,000, but were more angry and embittered by the personal and emotional slights inflicted upon them. John Kearns, perfect case in point, he lost about $300,000 or $400,000 to these guys. But what he remembered when I spoke to him, this was 5 years after the scam was over, and what he could not forgive was that they had compelled him to run all over the world while his wife was dying of multiple myeloma, and he felt that those acts of manipulation and strong-armed, gratuitous demands were done for no other reasons than make him suffer, and he did. Barbara Lawrence was another case in point. She had to fly to Switzerland for a contract meeting, even though she explained that her beloved grandmother had just died, and so she was unable to sit Shiva or pay respects to this woman she loved her entire life, because she was compelled to fly across the Atlantic for a bogus and completely inconsequential meeting.
Yeah, so it's really incredible how these
And
they manipulated the victims.
and if I might add, I mean, we can go in so many different directions here. Despite all of this, and despite the fact that all of this is clearly spelled out in the paper trail, which is extensive, each of the scoundrels I spoke to, Cesar certainly, and the administrator, Colonel Sherry, insist to this day that it's not Barbara Lawrence or John Kearns who are the victims, but that they themselves are the ones whose trust and whose integrity has been abused, whether by the U.S. prosecutors who unjustly sent them to jail, or by the borrowers who failed to meet their contractual obligations, or if you want if you want me to add me to the list of this journalist who tells a story of their illicit activities.
Right. So, I mean, what do you think is the psychology behind that? Are these people who are just such inveterate liars that you'll never get the truth out of them? Do you think they deceived themselves? I mean, Caesar in particular, I wasn't sure whether he believes the story he's telling or if it's just running another scam.
I think it's possible a little bit of both.
Mm-hmm.
I think that in order to be a successful con man, you have to believe the lies that you tell others. And I also have come to suspect that the lies that we tell others begin and are at their core based on the lies we tell ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the psychology is quite complicated. I think that there's a good portion of Colonel Sherry and Cesar and the others who believe the bullshit that they dispense when they're roping their clients, and they have to. That doesn't excuse them. In fact, I have a measure of pity for Cesar,
Mm-hmm.
but I have a greater pity for those that he has hurt. And so when I spoke to him, he was without cessation running on this hamster wheel of self-pity, where he had developed a very sophisticated narrative that blamed the prosecutors for their unjust persecution, that blamed the borrowers, his sense of injustice and the injustice directed at him included his mother, who had abandoned him at the boarding school in Switzerland, the fiancée who had abandoned him after he was convicted of multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy. Um, he recalls with a sense of, not despair, but inevitability, that the school he wanted to attend as a college freshman declined to give him admission, that the bouncer at Studio 54 refused to give him access in 1978. So he's got this long list of complaints that he carries with him, and it's a burden. To complicate this psychology further, he offsets that sense of despair by embracing no shortage of new age feel-good self-improvement therapies.
Mm-hmm.
Everything from Landmark to Tony Robbins, Tony Roberts,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
square-jawed empowerment guru.
Mm-hmm.
So he has tried to do a lot of work to find a sort of measure of peace in his life, but it's offset by his indictment and incarceration for the fraud, and prior to that for being caught smuggling cocaine into Finland. So he's got a bit of a rap sheet that he's has had to tend to.
Mm-hmm. Now, have you heard anything from him since the New Yorker article or the book came out?
Yeah, I've heard some things. I mean, it's been very limited. I think up until the time that the piece in the New Yorker was published, um, he endorsed my inquiry, and I tried to be forthright. Um, at first, I held my punches. I told him at the outset that I was a journalist and a writer, and that I was working on a story about the boys of Belvedere and the men they became. And that was true as far as it went, but it took, and this is noteworthy, I think, it took an inordinate and unexpected amount of courage on my part to confront him, not about the crimes he had committed as an adult, but to look him in the eye and say, hey, this is what you did to me when I was 10. And that I only did at the very end, at the very last of a series of meetings. And
Mm-hmm.
although he embraced my desire to come to terms with that childhood injustice and trauma, when he held the article and or the book in his hands, so subsequent to actual publication, he changed his tune and in fact denied having ever said many of the things that were in fact he did say to me, and which he confirmed in great detail when talking to the fact checkers at the New Yorker.
That's interesting. Yeah, the New Yorker has a notorious fact checking department, and I don't think anything would
No,
slip by them easily. Um, do you think that? I mean, it was obviously, in some ways great good luck that your childhood bully, was involved in a bizarre international scam, because it created this great book. Um, like, you know, is the child the father to the man? Was Cesar like rotten from the beginning? Actually, the bully who I referred to earlier, I know that he sells real estate in Manhattan, which is probably a good career for someone of that persuasion. Um, you know, if Caesar had led an anonymous
Well, you know,
Like, as an adult, how would you have felt?
yeah, I mean, I did for the I toggled back and forth in my before I knew what he became, wondering what would happen or what he would become. And for the longest time, I didn't fantasize, but I expected, I presumed that he would just disappear into some middle management job uh, somewhere in Southeast Asia. He's born he's from the Philippines. Um, Reality proved that particular narrative to be wrong. Um, I will say that I have always held I've had when my son and I were crafting this story about the bully, Leon and the Spitting Image. I remember there was a certain moment when my editor in New York proposed very gently that perhaps the bully should be rendered softened towards the end of the story. That maybe not quite uh, provide him a heart of gold or a sense of remorse, but something that would temper the orneriness that is described and illustrated in considerable detail in the book. And I remember just shaking my head. No, that's not. I don't know how I feel about that. And I spoke to my son, who at the time was no more than 9, and he said, "No way. There's no way. Some kids are just bad." That was Max's psychological contribution to this editorial conundrum,
Hmm.
and I concurred, and that was long before we discovered what had actually happened to Caesar. Um, I, I won't say that what Caesar is bred in the bone. I don't know that to be the case. I think that as children, are amazingly resilient and capable of reform, but it's clear that the issues he struggles with now are very much the same ones that he was struggling with back when he was in Switzerland. I mean, when I talked to him about Eglon, he didn't recall, first of all, uh, not, he didn't recall me. The boy I couldn't forget couldn't remember me. And
Hmm.
what he could remember is this long list of the kids who made his life miserable. So, and he had a much more extensive list of bullies than I ever did,
Uh-huh.
and his inventory of slights was much longer and detailed than my own.
Hmm.
So, all I can tell you is that he carried the seeds of his self-justifying behavior and self pity and remorselessness around even as a child. And he remains, uh, unless he's changed his tune, but when I last spoke to him, completely remorseless about any of the pain that he caused the people who had put their faith in his abilities as a financial representative.
Hmm. We're probably about near the end of our time. I guess one more question. What was the where did you get the most emotional catharsis? Was it from the confrontation or was it from writing the book?
It wasn't from writing the book. Um, I certainly had a sense of relief and transcendence, short lived though it was, after I finished speaking with him that one last time. And I felt a measure of relief that I can't fully explain when Cesar called me up and left this long message on my cell phone, in which, however provisionally and however in whatever with whatever qualifications, said point blank, "I apologize to you for whatever I may have done." But the deeper sense of satisfaction and surprise came uh, after the book and article were published, and among the many people who contacted me, there were three boys, no longer boys, three one-time boys, contemporaries of mine, who offered thanks because they, like you and like me, had had bullies as kids, but more specifically, they thanked me because they had been tormented by Cesar himself.
Oh, wow.
And so I had never imagined that I was one among many.
Hmm.
And so I felt as if, wow, the consequences of this story extended far beyond what I expected, and even offered a measure of solace and relief to other victims in ways I could never possibly have anticipated. So that was a pretty great feeling too.
Hmm. Well, the book is Whipping Boy. I'm holding up to the camera again. We will link both to where you can buy the book on Amazon or the New Yorker article, which I recommend everyone read. And if you read that article and enjoy it, which I think you probably will, I definitely recommend picking up the book. Um, so, Alan, thanks so
Out
much
of
for coming on.
self-interest, I would propose the alternative. First buy the book, then if you don't like it or if you like it so much, go and read the New Yorker piece. But either access point is appreciated.
Yeah, I mean, the book goes much more deeply into the search and the details of this fantastic scam, which are bizarre and uh,
And and there are lots of documentary, pictures, evidence
yeah,
that
right. You get to
really,
see all the characters, the
yeah,
fake prints, and all the people that he knighted, the celebrities, Sammy Davis Jr. It's an incredible story. Thank you
that it
for
is.
bringing it to light, and thanks for coming on Blogging Heads TV.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.